Hello there, James Duffy here. This technique video is going to be a little bit different as we're going to focus on a very specific technique for a very specific type of model rocket. A week before this video was shot, the privilege of hosting the 2023 FAI World Championships for Spacemodels was awarded to the United States, which means that the Olympics of model rocketry will be returning to the US for the first time since 1992. For a number of legal and regulatory issues, these championships will be using US rocket motors only. That means that competitors traveling to the contest from outside the US won't need to worry about sourcing or shipping motors, but it does pose another tricky challenge. For many of the events that use 40mm airframe tubes, such as the parachute, streamer, or helicopter duration contests, most competitors use 10mm diameter motors sourced from European boutique manufacturers like this expended Delta B2 motor that I brought back from the 2002 World Championships. They're great motors, but just not legal for transport, sale, or use in the United States. Instead, we'll be using 13mm diameter motors like this Estes A3. The challenge is that 13mm motors won't fit inside a 10mm tube. Fortunately, it's easy to modify an airframe to accept a 13mm motor. So what do we need to have on hand to do this conversion? Well, we'll need an airframe, and we'll also need a long section of 13mm motor mount tubing. This is a paper tube here, but a fiberglass tube would work just as well. You can use a brass tube or a section of drill bit stock as a mandrel for manufacturing your own 13mm tubing. Here's a section of brass tubing that I've used as a mandrel in the past. You'll want a longer section of tubing than you might expect, ideally about as long as your airframe. You'll see why in just a moment. You'll also want a centering ring, or you can use a wrap of 6mm masking tape around the end of the tube. I'll show you how to do that at the end of this video. The first thing we're going to do is insert the 13mm motor mount tubing into the 40mm airframe and position that over a strong light source. I'm using a light table here, but holding the assembly up to a bright window should work just as well. We can clearly see the shadow that the motor mount tube creates inside the airframe tube. I'll zoom in for this next bit. With the motor mount tube roughly centered inside the airframe tube, I'm going to use a fine Sharpie pen to define my cut line. This cut line is going to be just to the small side of the cut. I'd rather have the fit too tight than too loose. Next, I'll use a fresh, sharp number 11 blade to cut the 10mm motor mount away from the airframe tube. I've zoomed back out for a better view of this next step. The centering ring has already been glued into place on one end of the 13mm motor mount section. Either epoxy or CA glues or perhaps even a white glue is fine for this step. Remember that you can also use several wraps of 6mm wide tape instead of a purpose-built centering ring. The end of the 13mm tube without the centering ring is then inserted into the airframe tube and gently forced through the cut we made. Pull the 13mm motor mount tube through the cut until the centering ring snugs up against the interior of the cone section. You can now glue the motor mount tube into place with either CA or epoxy. The fit is largely self-aligning or self-jigging, but if you want to make sure that everything is absolutely concentric, a simple jig could easily be made using either a laser cutter or a 3D printer. After the glue dries, you can cut the motor mount to your desired length, add fins and a recovery system, and go fly. If you don't have a 13mm centering ring handy, here's how you can use 6mm 1/4" masking tape to build up a ring. Just wrap the tape around the end of the tube until there's a noticeable step. We're looking for a noticeable step, probably about 2mm difference between the tube and the tape wrap. That will work perfectly for aligning the motor mount tube inside the airframe tube. Thanks for watching, and we look forward to seeing you at the FAI World Championships for Spacemodels in Texas in July 2023.